All right. This is the lecture video for week one, module one. Um, like I said in the intro video, these are probably going to get pretty long, so you might want to break these up into different sittings. You want your attention to stay fresh, you want to take notes. There is a quiz on each module, so make sure you take lots of notes. You don't want to be fast forwarding and rewinding through a video to go figure out answers. It's much quicker to just pay attention the first time and take good notes. But anyway, this first module is about basically all the history that preceded psychology before psychology was really a science, which basically just means it's a history of philosophy, because philosophy is arguably one way you could define philosophy as a field is it's the field of things that are either not quite a science or not yet a science. Psychology used to be a field within uh, philosophy, and right now ethics is a field within philosophy. Some people think one day there's going to be a science of ethics, but that's we can go debate that another time. Here's some of the themes of the course. One theme is asking a serious question: is psychology a science? Some related questions: what is science anyway? Are there certain parts of psychology that are more scientific than others? This is a more important question than you think, because if you are going to be a psychologist, hopefully, when you're charging people money, billing people's insurance, uh, getting people's hopes up, spending people's time, hopefully you're doing something that's evidence based. Hopefully you're doing something that's worthwhile. Hopefully you're not swindling them or wasting their time or getting their hopes up only to squander them. You want what you do to be worthwhile. So it's important to ask, is what we're doing as psychologists, is this legitimate? Is it scientific? Is some parts of it more art than science? Is that okay? What kind of evidence am I looking for whenever I choose to help people with all this psychological knowledge that I've acquired? A couple of more specific questions that are going to come up a lot uh, are things like, are we just a product of our environment? Are we just shaped by our environment? Or is there some sense in which our own mind, our own autonomy, and free will play a role in what kind of person we are? I think that's a more comforting thought. Um, Another related question is, where do our concepts ultimately come from? Are we limited in what we can think based off of the concepts that are in our culture? If we're limited to only certain concepts, where do those concepts come from? And then, what is the mind anyway? Psychology is the study of behavior, the mind, and mental processes. So, just what exactly is this thing that we're studying? Can we even answer that question? So, before we even get into the first points in the timeline, there's a sort of vague gray area beforehand, where before any of the big names pop up, where many histories of psychology just say, well, uh, people in hunter-gatherer times, people in early civilizations, agricultural civilizations, basically people before ancient Greece, just everyone before that point usually believed in some form of animism or spiritualism. And this is a view that basically everything has some sort of consciousness or agency, not just people, but the world itself, different locations like rivers or valleys, and people's behavior and the the things that happen to them in their lives have a lot to do with these different objects and places having their own spirits, their own intentions. And that's really how a lot of people before ancient Greece understood the world. It's how they understood mental illness, abnormal behavior. It's how they made sense of their lives. It's probably an overly general statement, but it is fair to say most people, according to archaeologists and anthropologists and whatnot, believed in some form of animism or spiritualism. But let's get to ancient Greece. According to not just the history of psychology, but any history book you read, it seems, history began in ancient Greece. Um, and you're probably reading some of this stuff and wondering what the hell are these people talking about. Uh, One of the first philosophers we're going to talk about, Thales, believed that everything was made of water. This might seem like a strange concept, why you even make that theory. But it's not even that weird of a theory, though, if you imagine for a second that you don't have modern scientific knowledge and you're just thinking, hey, water evaporates. When you boil water, it turns to steam, and water freezes and turns to ice. It seems that, at least as far as water is concerned, well, we know water and steam and ice are the same thing, but you get into Thales' worldview. What did Thales know back then? And you think, well, maybe every substance is just a different phase or state of the same underlying substance. That's what a lot of these pre-Socratic philosophers were really arguing about. Thales, Anaximander disagreed and said everything's made out of the boundless, not water, boundless. I'm not going to get into what he meant by that. Heraclitus said everything was made out of fire, everything is in flux. He coined that phrase, you can never step into the same river twice. He has some points. And then these two people, Parmenides and Zeno, said that actually nothing changes. Change is an illusion. If you assume that things change, then you get paradox. You cannot trust your senses. The real knowledge comes from pure reason, unsullied by the trickery of perception. And it's okay if you're wondering, what the hell does this have to do with psychology? That's why I'm here, to answer questions like this. I'll give you a quick preview. The earliest school of psychology, the earliest school of medicine, they go hand in hand. The history of psychology and the history of medicine are very coextensive. But the very earliest school of psychology could be said to be humor or humoral theory, which we're going to get to later. It's a theory by Hippocrates that we have four humors in our body, or four fundamental substances. And all this talk of substances and balance in the universe and these weird things these ancient Greek people were arguing about actually had real world effects, because all the earliest quote unquote scientific doctors, so people that aren't witch doctors and exorcists, people you might call real scientific practitioners of something that is supposed to be scientific, at least, these people's theories of the world were based off of the dialogue that these philosophers were having about what everything is made out of. So these are the earliest. We have some more, but anyway, these philosophers that I'm talking about right now are called the pre-Socratics. They're called the pre-Socratics because they came before Socrates. So Socrates must be very important if everybody that came before you is just called people from before Socrates. And the main thing I want you to remember about the pre-Socratics is that they argued a lot about what everything is made out of and what are the characteristics of these substances. What do they do? And the reason I want you to know that is because it fueled the first school of thought on psychology. Trust me, we're getting there. I get a lot of weird looks when we first jump in here. You ever heard of Pythagoras? He's another pre-Socratic philosopher, very big into math. Also was very big into this idea that the world we see is not really what it seems, and real knowledge is knowledge of abstract things like mathematics. The soul is separate from the body. That's going to be very important later. You had Empedocles, who believed the world is made out of 4 elements. See, everyone before was saying it's all just one thing, but Empedocles started to posit that there's actually separate elements. He didn't get the elements quite right. The first person ever to talk about this stuff didn't just automatically come up with the periodic table. That would take a lot longer for people to come up with. But he started with earth, fire, air, and water. Not bad if you don't have microscopes or any real scientific instruments. He said there are these 4 fundamental substances, and then he said there's only 2 forces governing how this matter interacts. He called it love and strife. I think that's a pretty dumb thing to call it, but you could call it attraction and repulsion. That sounds more scientific, but these were philosophers. Maybe they're waxing poetic a little bit. Empedocles also had a theory of perception. He believed that the objects that we see in our environment, all the walls and chairs and whatnot, are projecting little copies of themselves called eidolons or ghosts, which get into our bloodstream somehow. So, like, the reason that you know to start stepping differently, like you're walking down the hall and then you need to start walking down these stairs, so, walk accordingly. The way that you're able to navigate through the world without stumbling around and hurting yourself, according to Empedocles, is because the world and all the objects in it are sending little ghost versions of itself that you breathe in, gets into your bloodstream. Yeah, these people don't have any scientific instruments. They don't have any previous scientific knowledge. These pre-Socratic philosophers are doing the best they can with basically no empirical observation. This is just pure introspection, imagination, some logic. I mean, it might not seem very logical now, but they would debate and use logic and peer review and critique each other. And Empedocles also added this idea. This is very important. He added this idea that the elements that make up our body, and there's only the 4 elements: earth, fire, air, and water. He said that it's important to keep these in balance because the elements that make up our body are, if they're not in proper balance, if these attraction and repulsion and the balance of the elements aren't lined up, you can become sick, get a disease. This ended up being a very influential way of looking at things. Then you have Democritus. Interesting thing about Democritus is he proposed that every object is composed of atoms, these little teeny tiny basic units of indivisible substance that can't be reduced anymore. A lot of people like to talk about Democritus because his theory of atoms sounds very modern, but please keep in mind that Democritus said that atoms are indivisible. Once you've broken something down to just its atoms, you can't break them down anymore. Of course, nowadays we know that atoms themselves have subcomponents like electrons and neutrons and whatnot. So that was just a lucky guess in the right direction, I guess. Instead of eidolons, though, you see these people are progressing slowly towards something that's going to sound more and more reasonable to the modern ears. Instead of objects sending eidolons or ghosts of themselves into our bloodstream, Democritus said, well, maybe the atoms, so it's something physical, but maybe the atoms are getting into our bloodstream somehow. If everything's made of atoms, then maybe somehow the atoms contain information, but they're indivisible. I don't claim to completely understand what these guys were thinking. And actually, a lot of scholars don't really know what these guys were thinking because we only have later writings. We rarely have these people's first-hand account of what they actually thought. We just have a cousin of a friend of a grandparent said that Democritus said this. So, I keep saying that the humor theory of Hippocrates is why we're talking about all of this. So, these ideas, when we get to it, these were dominant ideas about how to treat mental illness. These were dominant ideas of how to treat any kind of sickness, and they were explanations for people's temperaments and personalities. So it's very relevant to psychology. But before we get there, there's a few other things I want to say about clinical psychology in the ancient world, the ancient and partially the medieval world. So uh, there were a lot of ancient and medieval cultures that seem to hold a dual conceptualization of mental illness. A lot of histories of psychology will tell you that if you had abnormal behavior, if you engaged in self harm, if you had unrealistic thoughts or perceptions, or inappropriate emotions, inappropriate behaviors, right? These are all things that scream mental disorder to a modern ear. A lot of histories of psychology will say, well, way back when you exhibited any of these behaviors, you were called a witch, or people thought you were possessed by demons. It was something supernatural. In actuality, while this did happen to some extent, it wasn't as rampant as some histories make it out to be. And people seem to think that, on the one hand, they would go to a shaman or a temple priest for healing and believe ultimately that their illness, even if it's a mental illness, does have a cause from, say, angering one of the spirits or gods. But you also had trained physicians who collected herbs and, performed minor surgeries. And people seem to think, they seem to think both could be true at the same time. And even that if you have a physical illness, it's ultimately because of some supernatural cause, but you have to treat it with physical medicine. And there's also the phenomenon of trepanation, very relevant to the history of psychology. A trepanation is when you would perform basically brain surgery on someone. You drill these holes into someone's skull. This was done long before people had, anesthesiologists, very sharp surgical tools, ERs, anything like that. Well, anthropologists and archaeologists have found these remains of humans that are very old, much older than modern medicine, that have these holes in their brains, which or holes in their skulls, which show signs of healing, which means that the person who underwent this operation was alive for some time after the operation. This suggests that people would perform brain surgeries, in quote unquote caveman times, hunter gatherer times, early agricultural societies. You see this all around the world: South America, Asia, Africa, everywhere. And they even seem to be more successful than more modern surgeries, like around the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, when quote unquote, well, I don't want to say quote unquote, when modern scientific medicine started to take shape, those brain surgeries weren't always as um, routinely successful as these trepanations. So it's kind of impressive that people were able to perform these surgeries to begin with, but why were they performing them? There have been some speculations that it was to try as maybe a last ditch effort to cure, like, hypercephaly, or I don't know. There's all kinds of theories about legitimate physical reasons for performing these uh, procedures, but the majority of scholars, rightfully, I think, would do this because people would have, constant headaches, convulsions, mental disorders, uh, things that seem to have no physical cause, and they must have known it's coming from the brain somehow. And they thought, oh, you drill a hole in the head and maybe it'll relieve something, relieve some pressure, allow a demon to escape. It's very shrouded in mystery, and since this is so widespread around the world, there's probably even a variety of reasons why people would be performing these operations. Um, yeah, and then Not everyone knows this, but for the longest time, hysteria was considered to be a very common mental disorder that was specific to women. And this was common knowledge, that it was caused by the uterus wandering around inside the body. So the treatments for this would be to spray cold water at a woman's abdomen or to reach in and adjust the uterus. Some pretty, I'd imagine, uncomfortable and definitely unnecessary procedures for trying to cure an illness whose cause has nothing to do with the uterus. Imagine having bipolar disorder or histrionic personality disorder, and a bunch of men decide they need to mess with your uterus in order to fix you. Um, Very glad that we're now practicing largely evidence based, science based psychological treatment. That's kind of one of the main points of this course, is to really appreciate how far we've come and to look at what we're doing now and ask yourself, are we really helping people? Because the stakes are higher than you think. We could be at least wasting people's time and money and squandering their hopes. We could even be doing harm, although compared to some of the stuff we're going to look at in the history of psychology, we're probably not doing as much harm as some people in the past. Anyway, the dominant school of thought for explaining people's personalities, their health, where diseases come from, including mental diseases, quote unquote, or mental disorders, came from Hippocrates. Hippocrates thought there were four types of substances or humors in the body. There was phlegm, blood, yellow bile, and black bile. So if you met someone and they had a runny nose, or if they seem to have high blood pressure, or if they're vomiting certain substances like what you might call yellow bile, these were associated with different diagnoses. And once this theoretical framework got deeply baked into the emerging modern scientific medical field, which by today's standards might look very crude, extrapolations got made from this. Someone who has overall high elevations of phlegm in their body, this was thought to be an explanation for why some people were sluggish and unemotional. Nowadays, we might say, well, it's not that you're high in phlegm, it's that you might have major depressive disorder, or you might have some type of schizotypal personality traits. If you had elevated levels of blood, this was called being sanguine. This is an explanation for why certain people are more cheerful than others. Being high in yellow bile made you choleric, quick-tempered, fiery, easily angered. Nowadays, we might call that anger management issues. Having too much black bile made you melancholic, very sad. You might instead say, well, maybe you actually have major depression. And, it might seem silly to say, well, this is because there's some chemical imbalances in your system. But isn't that what we now think in psychology? If you have depression, we don't say you have too much black bile. We say you have certain types of serotonin that is too much in abundance in certain parts of the brain. So let's give you a SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or like Zoloft or something like that. The methods are a lot more evidence-based and actually probably a lot more helpful than trying to get rid of excess black bile. I feel like it's safe to say that. But the underlying logic, the underlying model of the situation has stayed surprisingly the same. All right, like I said, I think it's worth stopping and emphasizing the fact that these were the best theories people could come up with at a time when they didn't have any background scientific knowledge, or virtually no knowledge, especially compared to what we have today. They didn't have special scientific instruments like microscopes or, voltage meter readers. They had nothing. Just whatever they can see with their naked eye and logic and introspection. When you read early psychology from long before now, most of them are just saying things like, I think this is how human nature works because when you think about it, a lot of people seem to act this way, and I think it sounds like a plausible explanation. I can't think of any reason why it wouldn't be that way. And then someone comes later and tries to think of counterexamples. So they're not really using systematic empirical observation like we do today. They're kind of using their gut or their instincts. They're being as rigorous as they can with that as their only thing to go off of. But I think it's real important to stop and really put yourself in their shoes, not just to gain a better appreciation for their theories, but also to ask yourself tough questions about what we're doing today. What are we doing that's so much better? I think that's a very important question to try and answer. And the answer is not as easy as you might think. That's why I have a whole discussion forum about it. But let's move on to Socrates, the man that's so important that everyone before him was called pre-Socrates or the pre-Socratics. Well, we actually don't know that much about Socrates because he didn't write anything down. His student Plato says that he wrote down a bunch of things that Socrates said years later, but then Plato started just putting his own ideas in Socrates' mouth. And aside from that, some people wrote some plays where Socrates was a main character, but yeah, we don't know really much else about his ideas except what these other people said. Oh, and my little meme I made of this guy doing Socrates as a little hand puppet. Apparently, I wasn't the first person to think of that. In the 13th century, someone basically came up with the same meme idea, except it wasn't a meme, it was like a tapestry. I guess that was their memes back then. So let's go to Plato. Like I said, Plato wrote a lot about what he says Socrates said, and that shifted eventually into Plato saying Socrates said this stuff, but we know it was actually just what Plato thought. What did Plato think? Well, all these guys had a theory of perception, and well, actually, we're not at the perception part. Excuse me. Everyone had a theory of substance, and Hippocrates, with his four humors, is probably the most important theory. But something that's really overlooked with Plato, which I think is very interesting, is his theory of what every substance is made out of. All these shapes down here are special mathematical shapes. I don't remember the details. I think it's the only solids, the only three-dimensional solids you can make with sides with the same shape or something like that. I don't remember the exact details, but these are the only 5 you can make. It's been proven. And for some reason, we call them the Platonic solids, even though Plato did not come up with them. I don't know why Plato gets all this credit for things. So he gets to take credit for, he gets to use Socrates to lend himself credibility, and then he has the Platonic solids named after him. He didn't even come up with them. But anyway, his theory with the Platonic solids is interesting. He thought that everything is made out of one of these Platonic solids. Fire is made out of little tetrahedrons, little pyramids. I guess that makes sense because if you touch fire, it hurts, and tetrahedrons have these sharp corners. Earth is made out of cubes. When you dig up some dirt and look at it, it kind of looks like a bunch of little clumps of cubes, and they're flat. You get a lot of earth together, it looks mostly flat. And water are a bunch of icosahedrons. If you took this icosahedron, or this one in this picture is a little better, if you rolled this, it would actually roll. It's almost a ball, so it kind of makes sense that water would be made out of a bunch of little balls because it rolls and slushes around everywhere. It's a neat idea. Obviously, that's wrong, but again, these people, all they had was like, look, we've got math, and we got to use math to explain stuff, so let's explain it with the math. That's what they had to work off of. Plato aligned himself with Parmenides and Zeno, and to some extent Pythagoras. And he believed that real knowledge came from pure reason. You see, he's real big into the math. Everything's about math. That the world that we live in is just an illusion. So if you want to learn real things, you should sit in your armchair and think about math and stuff like that. Eternal truths. But the world that we actually live in is not that not that important. Seems like a very privileged worldview to have, personally. But anyway, Plato had his theory of perception. So Plato thought that all real knowledge was abstract knowledge about mathematics, but of course he had theories of perception and what the world was made out of, everything. He was an aspiring proto-scientist just like everyone else. Plato's theory of perception was the emission theory of perception, and was actually the dominant theory of perception for a long time. And it's basically the idea that our eyes shoot out bunches and bunches of tiny little lasers, for lack of a better word. And when these lasers bounce back and hit the retina at different angles, they wouldn't have called it a retina back then, but when they get back to our eye, our brain infers what must have been out there based off of how they ricocheted back. If you don't know, this is not how perception works, but a lot of ideas have to start somewhere, and you have to use empirical evidence to show that they're wrong. This is the world we live in now. Contrast that with the world that these guys lived in. Plato also had a theory about the human soul, which you could also say is a theory of the human mind. It was the tripartite theory of the soul. I want to see if this reminds you of anyone. So Plato's theory of the soul was that there are three parts, hence tripartite. The main part was the rational soul, like the charioteer. This is the one that's in charge of the whole show, but reason and rationality itself cannot drive the organism. You need the emotions and the spirited soul, that's like the passionate, emotional side of you. And you need the appetitive soul, that's the part of you that has basic needs like hunger and thirst. Hunger and thirst, the appetitive soul, and the spirited soul are the two horses that pull the charioteer. And reason is what manages and oversees and makes sure to leverage these forces into something adaptive and useful. The idea that the human soul or brain is divvied up into distinct parts that have distinct roles should remind you of a little guy we're going to meet later named Sigmund Freud, who believed that the mind is split into the id, the ego, and the superego. It's not the exact same theory, but it is very similar, and we might talk a little more about it when we get to Freud. And yes, so Plato thought that the world that we live in is a world of illusion, and if you want real knowledge, you don't want to, you should think about math and stuff. But how do we develop memories? Plato believed that there's a physical world, although it is an illusion. However, we do have memories from our times in this illusory world. And Plato came out with a metaphor of a wax tablet. If you don't know, back in ancient times, to practice writing or just to preserve records, they would have these tablets with big rectangular bits of wax, and you could take a pen and write all over the wax, and if you ever want to erase it, you can melt it down and put it back down again. Plato thought that this is how memories work, that the perceptions that you have, even though Plato thought those perceptions weren't real. Anyway, when the lasers get back into your brain, they basically write on your brain like a wax tablet. And the way forgetting works is kind of like the wax softening, and that's why you need to keep rewriting and relearning certain things. That's all they had back then were metaphors. They couldn't look into the brain. They didn't have fMRIs. Cut them some slack. Next came Aristotle. This was Plato's student. Aristotle never got to meet Socrates, but everyone who's anyone would study under Plato at his academy, except Aristotle had enough of Plato and went and formed his own academy, and he called it the Lyceum, and disagreed with Plato about a lot of things. He was a pretty smart dude. Most or many academic disciplines, if you study their history, they started with Aristotle. That goes for zoology, literary theory, logic. The first chapter would be like, all right, here's what Aristotle had to say about our field, because he was the first one to write the first book about our field. So Plato thought the world was an illusion and that the real stuff is going on in the mind. The mind builds up and grasps the most important stuff. Aristotle, so this is Plato pointing up at the skies because abstract stuff is the most important stuff, and the mind must be used to grasp the real structure of the universe and the mathematics and all that. Aristotle, he's got his hand pointing down flat against the earth, saying, "Come back down to earth, Plato. If you want to learn about the world, you have to actually go study it. You got to go collect specimens. You got to go measure and count things." So Aristotle was more of an empiricist. He wasn't an empiricist in the sense that we're going to learn about later, but he was more interested in empirical observation, which is a very important part of what makes psychology scientific as opposed to this philosophy stuff. Yeah, this I wanted to cover. I might kind of skip over this. Fun fact: Aristotle tutored this kid that would grow up to be Alexander the Great. So if you ever tutor someone, be careful. You want to be on everyone's good side. I'm going to end this video soon because I think it's going to need to have a part 1 and part 2. Gosh, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that I have yet to go over. Real quick, after Aristotle, but before medieval times, a lot of histories kind of don't have much to say during these periods, which is kind of a shame because some important things happened. One of those important things is a philosophy called Stoicism popped up. Stoicism is a very popular in the self-help genre right now, and a lot of psychologists, legitimate psychologists, also embrace Stoicism as a real therapeutic strategy. It's basically all about accepting the moment, controlling what you can control, and just being accepting of the things you can't control, controlling your emotions, being disciplined about your emotions. There's some really cool ideas, and they had their roots during this period. Another very important thing that happened between ancient Greece and medieval Europe, because gosh, those had to be the only things happening in history. If you read all the history books, that's all they talk about. But there's this very important thing that happened where the West, which means Europe in this context, kind of went to hell in a handbasket. Libraries got burnt down. Uh, the Roman Empire fell. It's not completely unfair to say that, learnedness and scholarly activity kind of took a dip. Some people don't like it when you say that and think that it's exaggerated, but it's not that exaggerated. It's not that exaggerated. But what happened is a lot of Middle Eastern scholars were getting their hands on all this good Aristotle stuff, all this good Greek and Roman stuff. They brought it back to the Middle East. They studied it. They contributed to it. All these theories of perception, theories of logic and the brain and the mind, these Middle Eastern scholars really built on these foundations, built several stories onto these foundations, while in the West and Europe, people were kind of losing their mind. And at one point in, was it Cordova in Spain? There was this very important moment where a bunch of Middle Eastern scholars came over and said, "Hey, you want some copies of these books?" And Europe actually rediscovered some of its own people, like Aristotle. There were texts from Aristotle that they didn't have access to because they were lost for a long time. So it was new Aristotle stuff and improved Aristotle stuff. So the medieval period really benefited from that. Like I said earlier, witchcraft, pacts with the devil, demonic possessions weren't. So this is an explanation for mental illness to some extent, but this wasn't as widespread as many histories make it out to be. But they thought that witchcraft and pacts with the devil could cause all kinds of things: impotence, sterility, lust, prostitution, hallucinations, visions, mutism, apparitions, alcoholism, depression, sleepwalking. Uh, Modern ears might hear this and say, sounds to me like substance use disorders or schizophrenia or depression. These are now considered medical ailments or medical treatments, and they have physical causes, and they should be treated with physical medicine and physical treatments. Like I said earlier, though, I think it's overstated sometimes how widespread these supernatural explanations were around. The people in medieval times and ancient times were aware that there are physical causes, and the same person would go to a priest sometimes, but a lot of times they'd go to a doctor. Probably more often than not, they'd go to a doctor before they went to a priest. And even if they did think there was a supernatural explanation for their problems, they probably thought that there is a physical mediator, right? So God might be mad at you, and that's ultimately why you're experiencing severe depression. But if you go to a doctor, the doctor is going to treat you with the humoral theory, the Hippocrates-based theory that we need to balance your four humors, because that is the physical mechanism by which God has punished you with depression. Not everything was bad in the medieval period, and I am about to stop this and restart on this slide right here. I'm going to start a part 2 on this slide. So let me just do a couple more. In medieval times, gets a bad rap for being unscientific or anti-scientific. Not totally fair, because the alchemists, they were not scientific, because trying to turn baser metals like lead into gold is not possible, and trying to create a philosopher's stone to make you immortal is not possible. And there were a lot of tricksters and frauds amongst the alchemists. But not every alchemist was a fraud. Some of them were just studying matter and their properties, and they would actually make medicine. And some of this medicine was effective, and they were kind of like early pharmacists in a way. There was also this very important figure named Reginald Scot. Reginald Scot was one of the many figures in the history of psychology who didn't just say, well, us doctors over here will put up with the supernatural and superstitious explanations going on elsewhere. If they come to us, we'll do our medicine stuff with our physical causes and whatnot. Repeatedly throughout the history of psychology, there's a figure who says enough is enough and is an important communicator of the value of more science-based medicine. Reginald Scot would say, hey, these witches, people that are possessed by demons, think they just have mental illnesses. And he actually even started to catalog mental illnesses and create taxonomies. This was an early precursor to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is kind of you could say is like the Bible of psychology. It's basically just a list of all the disorders that exist and what the criteria are for diagnosing someone with that disorder. So Reginald Scot was kind of the first person to get the ball rolling on that, although the ball really didn't start rolling too fast, too quickly. All right, last slide, and then I'm going to end this and do part 2 later, because this ended up being just even longer than I can tolerate. The Renaissance, which came towards the end, it's kind of debatable. When did the Renaissance or medieval period, when did one begin, the other ended? It's a fascinating question. You can go ask a historian. It was but the Renaissance and the Enlightenment were very important because it was a time when people were really starting to embrace scientific principles, and they're trying more often to get away from supernatural explanations for things, superstitious explanations for things. People were still very religious, but they were also becoming more scientific. And one of the most important developments during the Enlightenment was the heliocentric model of the solar system, which says that the Earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around. The view that everything revolves around the Earth is the geocentric model. Some of these details in this slide aren't terribly important. The main gist of what's important is that basically it was all but settled during this period that no, everyone, including the Catholic Church, most importantly, had been very wrong. The Earth is not the center of the universe. The Earth is just a small part of the universe. And it's very hard to go back in time and put yourself into the mind of someone who really thinks humans and human stuff are in the middle, the literal middle of the universe. They are the most important thing going on in the universe. And for science and scientific thinking to progress to the point to displace that idea is a testament to how successful science was becoming, but also a testament to how much it's going to change how people see themselves, the world around them, and what they mean in the world around them. So that's part one. I need to take a break, and I'm going to come back and do part two for the Module 1 lectures.